Welcome to the 17th video in the sampler granny square blanket. This video will be about putting the second edge around 2/3 of the squares, as well as joining the squares. To get started, we will need the linen color yarn, your crochet hook, which is 5mm, a pair of scissors, and a yarn needle. Now, collect all your squares that are not in the linen color. For these squares, you will need to add the second edge. To do this, you will start in one of the corners. You will start in the stitch that is right before the exact center of that corner. You will slip stitch the linen color into the square, or into the corner. Then chain 1. Now I like to crochet around my tail, so in the next stitch I will place 3 single crochets and I will crochet over the tail. This is all purely your choice. It just saves time when I'm having to sew in the tails in the next step. After those 3 single crochets, you will need to do the side. To do this, you will evenly space 27 single crochets down the side. Again, I am continuing to crochet over my tail. Once I think that my tail is fully secured, I leave it and I continue crocheting. Again, 27 evenly spaced single crochets. This is the same edge that we used on the linen squares. When you reach the corner, place 3 single crochets into the center stitch. Repeat these instructions around the square. Each side gets 27 single crochets, and each corner gets 3 single crochets. To finish off the round, we will slip stitch into the beginning chain 1. Then I like to chain 1 and pull up a long loop and cut. The second edge round is finished. Repeat these instructions for all of the squares that do not already have this second edge round. For me, that would be all of the gray squares and all of the dusty rose squares. The linen squares already have the second round of the edge on them, and this was completed in each of their assembly videos. Now it's time to tie in the tails for all 16 squares. Once I have tied in all the tails, I like to go in with sticky notes and pins and mark the front of each square. This helps me to determine the lineup of how I'm going to place the squares, and with the sticky notes I can write the square number onto the sticky note. I also use the pin head to help remind me visually of where the top of the square is, no matter the type of square that I am currently using. Pause here because this is the layout for the blanket. Each number represents the actual video that the square was made in. So the 16th square is the 16th video. The first square is the very first video. This series is in a playlist and it can be found on my channel. Now it's time to sew the squares together. I'm using a simple yarn needle. And you will notice that I tend to make the yarn that I'm using to sew the blanket together extremely long. That's just something that I do. You do not need it to be this long. I just like to sew my blankets all in one go, and I don't like a lot of tails into the joins of the squares, because if you use shorter pieces, the blanket can come apart over time. I am going to use a piece long enough to where each seam is one piece of yarn, so it has less chance of coming apart in the future. We're going to start with squares 12 and 6. Fold them, lay them where the front sides or right sides are together. And we are going to take our yarn needle. Now, as you can see, when they're sandwiched together, it looks like there's 4 stitches. You want to insert your needle into the 2 middle stitches, which is basically the back loop of each square. This is my way of joining. You do not have to do this. You could single crochet them together, but we are going to whip stitch them together. I have found that this method has the squares laying flat, and it does not have a ridge when you are looking at the front of the blanket. The reason my yarn is so tangled here is because I had actually sewn the blanket together incorrectly and I had to take it apart, so this yarn has been used a few times. It shouldn't be this tangled when you first start. Again, I just insert my needle into the 2 middle stitches and pull through. And the thing with whip stitching is you need to insert your needle in the same direction every time. So as you can see, I always insert from the bottom, pull up from the top, come back around, and insert from the bottom again. And I will continue this all the way down my squares. One thing I will note is you need to make sure on the top edge and the sides that you're sewing them to where they will have a straight, even edge when they lay flat, so that your border will have somewhere to grab onto when we're crocheting our border. You don't want there to be any valleys in between the squares, is basically what I'm saying. And you will see in a few minutes how I actually sew the tails to make sure that the edges are straight. Once I complete the first 2 squares, I will continue with the 2 squares below this, continuing the seam. So the next 2 squares, according to our diagram, will be 14 and 2. So 14 goes below 6 and 2 goes below 12. Again, you lay them out and place them right sides together. So pin to pin. Now, when you are connecting these new squares, because you only have one connection point at the moment, it is very delicate. If you let these squares drop off of your table or off of your lap, it could pull the yarn. So you need to be very careful. Once you go in and crochet the other seam, it becomes stronger and these squares are no longer as delicate in that connection point. As you can see right now, it's just one piece of yarn holding that connection point, so you need to keep it as close as possible to the other squares until you sew the horizontal seam. Sometimes I even like to pin or clip these squares together until I can get that second seam in. I also tend to run 2 or 3 pieces of yarn at the same time with different yarn needles, so that once I sew this seam, I can immediately go into the other seam. Once you connect, you just continue whip stitching down the squares. And you continue this for all 16 squares. Again, pause here for the layout of the blanket. When you are done joining, you should have about 12 tails. Now, as you can see, I do have my tails. And as you can see, the blanket lays very flat along the seams. So we're going to tighten the tail, take our yarn needle, insert into a stitch right next to where your yarn is inserted, and I like to tie a knot. And then I hide the tail. I do this for all 12 of the tails that are part of the seams. Once you have sewn in all the tails, your blanket is ready for the border.